I think most common one, if you showed up to an AU basketball tournament, is just your communication, right? And that could be so broad. I would say communication behavior, because I've had coaches growing up that were like, "Yeah, man, Vic, man, just go do your thing, right? Like I got your back, like." And then you throw one turnover, and then you hear that like sub, right? And it's like, but you said I could go out there and go hoop, right? And just experiment, because I was that kid after a while that.
You are listening to the Beyond the Scoreboard podcast, transforming athletes into leaders on and off the court with host Coach Furtado. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Beyond the Scoreboard podcast. Today, I have with me Coach Victor Johnson. Coach Vic, he is an LA City manager for CHJS, Center for Healing and Justice Through Sport, and is also the Chief Experience Officer for Phoenix Basketball. Welcome to the show, Vic.
Man, thank you for having me. Big fan of the podcast. Always see your content everywhere, so it's really cool to be on this side.
Right on. Yeah, we're happy to have you here, and we want to do things a little bit differently because we found in your profile on CHJS website a great quote, and like we were talking about before, I want to start with it. And so the quote goes as such for the coaches and the parents that are listening. Sport is like a double-edged sword. Swung in the right direction, the sword can have tremendously positive effects, but swung in the wrong direction, it can be devastating. The sword is held by adults who supervise children's sports, whether sport is constructive or destructive in the psychological development of young children. Greatly depends on the values, education, and skills of those adults. Rainer Martin. And then we hit the mic drop. So why does that quote matter so much to you and the work you do with CHJS?
I think it stems from me just being an athlete growing up in Los Angeles. Love the game of basketball, love my overall experience, right, and my journey as an athlete. As I got older, I started reflecting and thinking about my past. There's some things that I struggle with as an athlete as well, from like a mental and emotional standpoint. I feel like I always love my coaches, right? There's always love, but when you get older, you start thinking about different practices or things that they were doing. They were like, that might have been kind of questionable, right? Some are harmless too, right? It's just like the coach, how we were coached type of idea. But just being in the work with the Center for Healing and Justice Through Sport, and being on kind of like the research and data side, and just like seeing like what are the right strategies, or what are strategies that help kids feel safe and feel motivated and feel like they can be confident young leaders. You start to reflect on just your past. So that quote, I feel like, just says it all, right? Like, I think we look at sport as this magical mechanism for youth, right? And it is. But all those life skills that we talk about that kids get from sport, it's like, it's not automatic, right? It's like, you have to be very intentional about how you're designing your sport experiences as a coach or a director, or even as a parent, right? Providing feedback to your kid, because it can also have those negative effects, right? Fear of failure, just different traumas that you kind of develop, fear of making mistakes, fear of just like going out there and trying your hardest because like you feel like you're going to get subbed out, right? And some of those feelings, I think for me, I started to see those show up in different parts of my life, which is why I just committed to the work that I'm in, to make sure that, in the future, ideally, that I could help make a dent in making those things change, right? And making sure that coaches and just the overall ecosystem of youth sport just understands that there is a much healthier way of approaching youth sport as a parent or as a coach.
And staying on track in terms of developing like a healthier way, I think kind of what CHJS does a great job of is coach education, which is to coaching and developing the human, right? Not necessarily, it's not the X's and O's, right? And that's what the Beyond the Scoreboard podcast is about. It's like beyond that. So I'm sure many of the listeners haven't heard of CHJS. So if you can give a crash course of it, and, that maybe a little bit behind, some of the science of effective coaching?
Yeah, for sure. So the Center for Healing and Justice Through Sport, we're a national nonprofit, um, and we believe like nothing heals like sport, right? So a lot of our training, our consulting, our system change work uh, happens around the brain science, a combination between the brain science and just like sports science, right? And best coaching practices. So everything that we do is built around the brain. So how trauma, stress, and adversity affect the brain, and then how can we design our sport experiences, right? Our practices, our games, the feedback that we provide to our young people in a way that's healing and biologically respectful to our young people, right? Kind of what I talked about in the beginning, we have to be very intentional. And when you're thinking about the brain is it's so complex, so intricate, right? And it's like, as a coach, as a parent, I think sometimes we we watch kids play sports, and we might say like, oh, this kid is acting out in practice, um, or this kid doesn't have it, right? Where we're not really thinking about like what type of baggage they're bringing into their life, right? Whether it's like from their community, whether it's like family baggage, whether it's some issues that they're dealing with in school. Like, I feel like sometimes as adults, we forget that kids are going through a lot, right? And especially after the pandemic, right? With COVID, it's like kids were in isolation like for years, right? So there's so many things that have impacted us, even adults, right? But really thinking about our young people as they develop that, at CHJS, we just want to make sure that we are helping to support coaches and parents in a way that allows them to have strategies and tools to understand what's going on in their young people's minds, just in overall life, but also, really importantly, in their experience as an athlete in sport.
Absolutely. And that's it's a big shift, right? Instead of seeing them as they're just coming to our basketball practice, they're just part of my basketball team. They're a human who's also a student, a brother, sister, son, daughter, all these different identities and labels that they may, internalize and have, and all these experiences. It's much bigger than showing up to their basketball practice, basketball game. And so
Yeah.
for me, with BTG basketball and building a basketball organization and program and wanting to have a lot of these focuses in mind that you're talking about, what, kind of advice or pillars of our, that I could put into our program that could really help and benefit these kids? Because I know there are coaches that are listening that have their own different programs out there.
Yeah, for sure. God, where do I even start? I mean, we even thinking about like how, like, let's say we're coaches, right? So it's like
Right.
being mindful of like, if you were the kid, right, you got to put yourself in the kid's shoes, right? As soon as you step into the gym, it's like the experience is activated, right? So are you a coach that's just kind of like sitting in, the back of the gym, kind of just like not really paying attention, maybe on your phone as your kids are coming in? Or are you the coach that's like, saying hi, giving dap to your kids coming in, saying hello to your families and parents, right? I think that's like a big first step, thinking about like the moment like folks even coming to your gym, right? Is the space set up, right? Do kids know where to get dressed, right? To put their shoes on, or do they know what to do once they put their shoes on, right? Or is it awkward where it's just like, I don't even know what to do, right? So it's really communicating and setting up the space. I think is a really good first touch point, right? Then your first interactions with your kids are so important, right? Again, like I talked about there, you don't know how their day has been, right? And for a lot of these kids, like the basketball space or the sports space should be their like safe haven. They should feel like, yo, like I don't care what I was going through, right? I know my parents was yelling at me, like, my teacher was yelling at me, or whatever it may be. It's like the basketball space should be that place where people feel safe. So often that tone is set from the coach, right? So off top, like you have a responsibility to set the tone of like how your kids are going to feel, as they come into practice, right? And then from there, say you're starting the practice, like, are you providing a experience where your kids get to kind of reflect, check in with them, like, how are you doing today? Like, what's the stuff that's been going on in your life, right? Like, how do you feel today? Sometimes we do check-ins of like 1 through 5, right? We'll say like, all right, everybody, like we're in a circle. We're like, yo, if I'm gonna say 1, 2, 3, throw out a number. Like if you really just like are not feeling it today, and it's just like I'm here, I'm showing up, and that's all I can do, that's a 1, right? If you are feeling great, like I'm here, I'm live, I'm active, like I'm ready to go, like you're a 5, right? So and then just having those experiences allows folks to kind of like us as coaches to kind of check in and know where our kids are at so that when it's time for us to provide instruction, things like that, we kind of know how our kids are doing, and we can adjust based on just like because we're human beings and things happen in our lives that even coaches we get dysregulated, right? I think check-ins are important. Even in a check-in, we think about kids, right? They don't at school they get told what to do, right? They say they get told where to sit, when they can go to the bathroom, right? Like don't talk, right? So often throughout the day, it's like they're just kind of sitting there just taking in information, right? They could be in a family dynamic where, they're not, you don't uh, speak unless spoken to, right? Like sometimes kids are in environments where they don't get to like express what's going on with them, right? So as we talk about having a basketball space where it should be their safe haven, like how do we introduce moments like that where they are communicating, right? And then that translates to like them communicating more on the court, right? We have some coaches get frustrated with kids not talking on defense or not talking in a game, but it's like, have we provided spaces for them to practice talking and communicating, right? These are just some things. And I'm really, if we're looking at a practice plan, we haven't even started practice yet, right? But these are just a few things that we can be mindful of just at the beginning of our practice, thinking about the space and like how we start our practice, and the routine of this to make sure that our kids feel safe and that we are able to connect some of those life skills early on with them, that we want to see come out in their practices or their games when they are playing basketball.
Right. And you're talking about communication on the court, right? That's obviously one of the big ones. But communication is a skill, right? So you're talking about creating a space where they get to practice talking and get to practice that skill before it becomes, a live setting where, you can't be thrown in the fire if you haven't, practiced that skill and have the opportunity to make mistakes and learn from those mistakes and continue to grow with it. And
For
so kind
sure.
of I want to kind of add on to this conversation in terms of with your work and what you see. I know you worked in the AAU world for 4 years, right? The high level basketball and like AAU is, they're treating like 10-year-olds, right? Like
Mhm.
professional athletes.
Yep.
And so when, a program or, I don't know what kind of pushback you've potentially gotten before, but I could, just see things in our mind, it's like, these elite coaches are like, well, these are high level athletes and we need to do X and X. So even with high level athletes in terms of high school basketball players, let's say, circuit players, are these strategies still effective?
100% because at the end of the day, every kid has a brain, right? And like, it don't matter if you're elite or not, like your brain is going to operate pretty similarly to stress and trauma and adversity and a lot of the feedback and dynamics that you're creating for your youth. Um, like that's like one of the big pushbacks, like, oh, what y'all talking about is being soft, right? And it's like,
Right.
like from a
Yep.
generation standpoint, but it's
Right.
like, no, it's like now people can't say it's being soft. Now we can actually put the brain science behind why some of these strategies that we've carried from generations are actually devastating, right? When we're thinking about long term for the development of our kids. When we think about like even like some of the like professional athletes, right, that have been a little more open about like mental health, like the DeMar DeRozans, Kevin Loves, Simone Biles in gymnastics, right? Like they grew up in kind of like that, very those type of environments where you had coaches that were very intense. And it's not to say that their entire experience or their coaches' experiences like were all like toxic, but like there are just better strategies to get more out of your kid. right? A lot of times Kobe talks about like we just talk at kids the entire time. But sometimes it's like it's the important thing is just asking the right questions, right? Helping our kids become problem solvers instead of just folks that are just really good at hearing orders and just like doing them, right? And I think with our athletes, I think like the young athletes who are in that elite space, who have those kind of elite coaches, and these kids are like super skilled. Like these young kids are like on a different level, but it's like some of these kids end up burning out by the time they're 14, 15, right? Because like we have to remember that this is their journey. This is not I'm the coach. Like this is not my journey. This is their journey, right? And each of those kids have a different journey. They have a different way of receiving feedback. They have a different way of just operating. So it's like as coaches, as we understand how like trauma and stress and adversity affect their brains in different ways, like as coaches, we have to be a little more intentional about how we're approaching different kids.
100%. No, and I 100% agree with you in terms of there right. You talked about the first thing you said was they have a brain. So yes, of course, all these strategies are going to be just as effective. And you kind of brought up the point that obviously coaches want to coach how they were coached, right? Kind of how what you talked about at the very beginning. And you're talking about soft. Now, can you talk about how some of your work has been kind of trying to relabel this and make it okay to coach in a different way than you were coached?
Yeah, and as you asked that question, it's funny. We had a training with LA Rec and Parks, like their all-star coaches, right? And
Yep.
I don't know if you're familiar with like some park systems, but they have like at the end of their sports season, they'll have like an all-star like tournament,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? Yeah. So
Right.
we do work in partnership with LA Rec and Parks and Nike, and these coaches, right? Like they're coming in, they're like they are there because they have to be there. Like if they don't do this all-star coaches training, like they know they can't coach. So we already understand like the kind of like initial barrier, right? So these are the same coaches that we're talking about right now. So, but at one of the trainings, it happened to be Kenyon Martin, right? Was one of the coaches, right? He has like I forgot if it's a son or daughter that's playing in the All Stars and he's coaching. So like, about Kenyon Martin, he, just he was like one of those tough cats, right? Like he was those guys that would not back down, right? Like one of those guys. And we were doing a portion about the brain, but what we were doing a portion about was like thinking about us as individuals, as coaches, like depending on the day, we might wake up on a spectrum of like we feel good, or it's like we're waking up in terror or fear, right? It's trauma is not just like black and white. Like there's like a whole spectrum of like where you kind of fall, depending on what the day is and depending on what has impacted you throughout your life, right? So we asked Kenny Martin, we were like, yo, like, we know like your upbringing and, we know that we were asking like, all right, where does everybody wake up? Like where you wake up on the peaceful side or like terror side? And Kenny Martin was like, man, I grew up in the terror side, waking up, like not knowing, like always looking over my shoulder, having just like really kind of tough, just life dynamics, family dynamics. And that's how I play basketball. Right. And so he's on like podcasts now. We kind of like listen to him and how he speaks, right? He's a father now. And as a coach, right, he understands that he doesn't have to coach in that way. Somebody like Kenyon Martin, right, who grew up in one of the toughest like kind of lifestyles, like it's cool like to see as a coach, like understands that like there's different ways of approaching his kids. Like his kids did not grow up in that lifestyle, right? Or in that environment. So he understands that he has to kind of like change things up. And I think that was really impactful for him. He came up to one of our colleagues. He was like, man, that coach's training made me realize and I have more clarity around how I was operating based on the traumas in my life. And now I can be a little more in control about how I can show up, knowing a little more about my brain. Right. So when we're thinking about some of the like that soft kind of element, we're thinking about like, oh, you're being soft. It's just like, I don't know, like I don't want to like label this, but it's just like it's kind of being a little lazy as a coach. You're kind of being a one-way coach, right? And that involves just like you have one way of coaching, and somebody doesn't fall in line with that, then like they're considered soft, right? And any strategies that like you incorporate into your life, or as a coach that I'm trying to incorporate into my like repertoire, like they don't fit because I'm not that coach, right? And what we understand is that if you learn about the brain, you learn about people's experiences. The 10 kids that show up on a team did not all grow up the same, did not all have the same family dynamics. Like these are 10 different brains that you're dealing with, if you think about it like that. So, um, sorry I got a little off topic, but I feel like that's kind of like when I think about the story of Kenyon Martin, um, that really made me realize like, wow, like this isn't just some recreation level thing. This affects like professional athletes and their reflection on their own experiences, and how they want to now show up, knowing a little bit more about trauma, stress, and adversity on the brain in their basketball space.
100%. And Kenyon Martin's a perfect example of growth. And I feel like that's one of the challenges, right, with, certain, just I guess you could call it people, but like we're in positions of power. Coaches are with their youth, right, which is incredibly important, right? Like that quote I talked about at the very beginning of our podcast. And we expect our athletes to constantly and consistently be growing, trying to work on their games on their own times. And if we expect that of our athletes, then we have to be willing as coaches to be open to new strategies like you're talking about for not only our players, but also for ourselves. Because,
Yeah, for
like you
sure.
talked about, like we set that tone at the start of practice. So if we're not checking in with ourselves, if we're not checking in with our own energy, then that's going to, kind of broil over and affect the kids as well.
100%. And I'm glad you said that because like that is like the core of like, what we want our coaches to leave with, right? It's like the whole point of learning about the brain and learning about how you set up your spaces, how you provide feedback is keeping your kids regulated, keeping their brains regulated, right? And what that means is like allowing kids to access their executive function, executive thinking, so that they can take in all the information, the instruction, the plays, the feedback that we try to provide for them, right? Like if we don't create those safe spaces, like that's where you find where kids are not accessing this part of their brain, right? Like brains are not already not developed yet to get to that point, right? And they're operating a lot in their emotional part of their brain. But it's like if we don't create a safe environment for them, then they're not regulating. They can't take in the information that we're providing for them. Now that's the kid, right? But like you said, we set the tone as adults. If we're not regulated, then our kids are not going to be regulated as well, right? Like a dysregulated adult cannot help or support a dysregulated child, right? So as adults, we have to be the ones that whatever we're bringing, right? It could be work was, I don't know, you had a bad work week, stuff going on in our lives. We're all human. We're all adults. Everybody's going through stuff, right? But us bring it into the space where our kids are, right? That's like the worst thing that we can do. So we always talk about as to coaches, like you got to find out what's that thing, like what's that thing that's just gonna like get you regulated, right? Could be music, could be like meditation, could be something, anything, right? But something to be mindful of as we're showing up in front of our kids as these leaders.
Right. 100%. And so my kind of like last follow-up question to really kind of clarify what we're talking about. Could you paint some pictures and give some examples of what like a traditional kind of non-safe environment looks like? Not in terms of like obviously they're going to be physically harmed, but we're talking about obviously in terms of their mental psyche, and then also with like discipline, right? Because I think that's a word that I've kind of is thrown around a lot in the basketball coaching spaces. They have to have discipline. So can you talk about painting clear pictures of safe versus unsafe environments, and then how a safe environment still has discipline structures within it?
Yeah, so like let's say like I say, I think a most common one if you showed up to an AU basketball tournament is just your communication, right? And that could be so broad. I would say communication behavior, because I've had coaches growing up that were like, yeah, man, Vic, man, just go do your thing, right? Like I got your back, like, and then you throw one turnover and then you hear that like sub, right? And it's like, but you said I could, like, go out there and go hoop, right? And just like, experiment, because I was that kid after a while that would not trust adults anymore, right? I hear you saying, like, I want you to go out there and do your thing, and then you do two, three, four things right, make one mistake, and it's like you're subbed out, right? So now as the kid, I'm just like, now I don't even want to do anything. I don't even want to make a mistake. I don't even want to try and take some risks, right? Like, which it's all over the basketball court, right? So I think from a communication standpoint, and just like thinking about a kid's development, knowing that they're going to go out there and make mistakes, is like being able to, like, make sure they feel secure in going out there and taking risks. And then when things happen, your behavior not being like, man, you know what I'm saying? Like, coaches just be reacting, being able to, like, kind of like, restrain from showing outwardly behaviors, right, of frustration, right? And it's so tough as coaches because there's so many things going on, but like, that's a responsibility that you have, right? And I think one thing, a quote that, or an interview I heard from Jason Kidd, or it might have been from like one of the players, somebody asked like why they feel so confident and why they feel so like calm on the court. And I want to say it was one of the players that they were talking to. I want to say it was Luca. But one of the players was talking about, well, our coach is very calm on the court. When things are happening, he's just like, we just got to like keep working, keep optimizing, just keep adjusting how we need to. And if you watch Jason Kidd as a coach, he's not like screaming and, reacting like crazy, right? And when somebody said that on the Mavericks, I was like, oh, that makes a lot of sense, because then I started watching the players and how they were playing, how they were reacting play by play, and they were very calm, right? And so I think that kind of goes back to like setting the tone as a coach. So I think it's that communication and you validating your communication as a coach help create safety, because if you're saying like, hey, I'm right behind you, I want you to just go do your thing, I want you to take risks, I want to see you grow, and your behaviors are not showing up in that way, then I think that like makes a kid not trust the situation, and then eventually makes a kid not feel like they can bring their whole self into the basketball environment, right? Which is so key.
Right.
Now, thinking about discipline, one thing that I've kind of seen, and I've been a coach that's done this before, is we get on kids about things that, one, we might not have even addressed or like shown that this is something that could come up in a practice, or have worked on things, right? We'll get on kids of like, what were you thinking, right? In a situation where we have coaches have not prepped our team in those situations, right? So when we're thinking about discipline, I feel like from a expectation standpoint, they're just kind of just like best practices the first that need to be communicated to your team and your players like beforehand, right? Like at the end of the day, we want our team to operate at a high level. Here are some things that are going to help us grow as individuals and as a team, right? Kind of having those expectations, making sure that they're realistic based on like the team that you have. And then now we can have a culture that we set is like, all right, discipline and how we do things is understand that we need to operate at a high level, and being very virtuous about our character, right? Then if that's the expectation, then we'll work on those things. Those things don't happen just in one tournament. That happens over time, right? So as a coach, also understanding that like maybe your team is not quote unquote disciplined at this point, but they're still kids learning even what discipline means, right? What does that even mean? And how as a kid, am I going to see that add value to my life? Like, where do I see that showing up, adding to like positive experiences, right? So I think from a communication standpoint, like you have to set that like beforehand. Then as a coach in our practices and everything that we do, a kid coming to the gym, or, how we start practices, like If we're going to talk about hustling, right, or things like that, a lot of kids don't know what that means sometimes, right? They don't know that we got to, dive it on the floor for a ball, right? Do we have drills where we're showing kids how to dive for a ball, or like the safety around, like if you're diving for a ball on the floor, like here's how to make sure that you don't get hurt, right? There's so many things that we have to build out as coaches that we don't. And we end up saying like, yo, these kids are not disciplined, right? Also, not understand, like, again, you had a one-on-one talk with your kid about, discipline? If a kid's not showing these values, right? Or what you want them to do, or what you want to see, right? We don't have one-on-one communication with our kids. We just, if the kid is not being disciplined, we kind of get on them, but we're not thinking about like, I wonder, like, what's the barrier? What am I not doing that's not allowing my player to understand like what we're trying to do, right? So there's a lot more strategies, a lot more deep diving that I feel like we need to do as coaches. But I'm very empathetic too of just like coaches, like there's a lot that we got to do, and like we're doing it, we're bringing a lot of our energy and effort, but it's just like if we can add a little more to our bag, some strategies and tools, some more routines to our bag, it's just going to make everything easier. And coaches are not going to have a lot of those problems around discipline or communication if we're able to build that into the routine of our young players.
100%. And so the running through line I kind of hear from that. So kind of talking about what you're talking about with Jason Kidd is he models, right? He uses his body language to model being calm and cool and collected, right? Instead of overreacting to the refs, overreacting to mistakes from players, right? So that comes from the coach in terms of their body language communication. And then as far as, discipline, right? Making sure that we communicate our standards of our team. It's got to be communicated over and over and over again. And then, of course, if there are certain players that are not meeting, whether it's the hustle standards, right? You have to ask yourself, are we communicating what that looks like enough? And then two, if we are we having a one-on-one conversation about maybe the reasons player X is not, kind of demonstrating that hustle? Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah, for sure. For sure. There's so many other examples, but like that's right. Like kind of one of my gut reactions. Yeah. Based off that.
Cool. I mean, that makes a ton of sense to me. And so for me, kind of as a coach and building out this program, I feel like as I'm hearing, I'm thinking like it's my responsibility now to communicate with the coaches what our standards are, and then how they communicate and they show up. And so that's kind of just like that leveling up of leadership in terms of it's now my responsibility to communicate that to the coaches, because every coach comes in with their different experiences, just like our different athletes.
Yeah, which is beautiful, right? You want your coaches to come in and feel like they can be their whole selves as well, right? And like we can be totally different coaches, but understanding like, yo, this is like our non-negotiables, right? As coaches, and still do great work, right? And it's not, again, we're not about the one-way coaching kind of landscape, right? As I talked about before. And so like, yeah, and it's not easy. You do have to spend time doing that. Like you have to figure out what do I want my program to be about? What do I want my coaches to be about? Because at the end of the day, we want our kids to stay in the game. We want them to be motivated and to want to keep developing. We want them to want to come back. And even if they don't make it to college, even if they don't make it on varsity or to college or the pros, like when they become adults, can they look back and say like, you know what, like I love this program. I love these coaches because like I learned X, Y, and Z and more. And I feel like I can directly look back to those experiences and translate them to like a lot of ways I think and a lot of ways that I go after my goals. I think that's like the best thing that we can, do for our young people through sport, because there's so much magic in it. But again, we just got to be very intentional, because if we don't, then you're going to find that the sword is swung the wrong way. And, there's a lot of mental challenges, even physical challenges that our young people are experiencing because as adults, like we're not doing that work.
100%. And so my last kind of like simple question in terms of that is like, what are your thoughts on like, or what CHJS is like procedures on like running, making players run for discipline or push-ups or whatever it is.
Yeah, this is like this is another one. I love this.
Yeah.
So we don't support making kids run because they didn't understand a skill or an instruction, right? Like there's so many other ways of helping a kid improve and get them up to whatever standard we need them to than running, right? Like I remember growing up running lines and running 17s, right? Because like we're over like 11 years old because like we didn't do the 3-man weave right, or maybe missed the layup, right? And it's like, as a coach, did if it didn't look right, like you could see that your kids are not doing the 3-man weave right, or it's like, let's start with that, right? Something, it's all over the place. How about this? Instead of yelling at them and saying they're not doing it right, did you get them together and ask like, hey, like, I know I communicated A, B, and C, right? What are some things that people are not like understanding, or like, does anybody have any questions about like how we need to be doing the weave or what needs to be happening? Like, right? We don't have those conversations with kids to check in with them to see where they're at, right? So it's like there's so many other things that we can do that are going to create a really good team culture and help our kids develop rapidly. But oftentimes we like to resort to just like penalties, and not realizing like, as a coach, we have kids missing layups in games all the time. I got to look back at my practice and realize like, oh wait, we haven't even allocated time for our kids to understand how to shoot a layup, right? Like they miss a layup and it's like 15 push-ups, but it's like, well, actually, you haven't incorporated any skill development to your practice. We're just working on the shell drill in our offense. And so when we resort to running or push-ups, I think it's just like, there's so many other things as coaches that we can do to make sure that kids are developing and our team is developing, that at the end of the day, if you have to resort to running or push-ups, we're not doing a lot of things in between to help them grow.
And so my own 2 cents with it is I feel like it's lazy, right? It's easy to just be like 10 push-ups for missing your layup, or, it's the line of 17s because we're not focusing. Like that's easy because we don't have to address them. We just have to, hey, you're running, why, right? But we don't address, we don't try and teach and get them to improve or whatever it may be, right? And so it's just these quick little penalties, and then, oh, you're back, and then we're back to it. And then it's a podcast conversation for another day, where if you're missing layups but you're only doing layups with no defense on, but that's another practice. That's another conversation
100%,
for another day.
100%. You get it.
Yeah.
You have to build up, and like in your practices, there's some basketball. I mean, all sports are really tough, right, to teach. But I feel like some with basketball, there's so many different skill sets that one player has to have. And
yeah,
you think about the game now, it's like every player has to have like more skill sets than I feel like they've had to have in the past. That if you're a coach and you're not really addressing those things and thinking about how to scale, right, and sequence a lot of those skill sets, then you're going to see a lot of those, things happen, like missed layups with defense and different, in different situations, right? If you're not practicing that, like how do you expect the kid to be fully confident, right, and being able to perform how they want to? So that's a whole nother
100%.
podcast, like you
It's a
said.
whole nother podcast, 100%. So kind of to continue on that point, is this the most efficient use of time, right? Instead of, right, doing something that's just focusing on defense, can we work on something that's both offense and defense at the same time? Because you only get, coaches, especially some youth coaches, if you're at AAU, it might only be an hour, right? You're sharing the gym with a ton of different kids, or
Sure.
90 minutes if you're a high school coach. Like you really have to get strategic on how you want to maximize that time. But to kind of go back to, what we were talking about in the beginning, as we kind of hit the 2-minute warning of our podcast, is it has to be a safe environment and an environment for our athletes to thrive and grow.
Yes, 100%.
So, with that, my final question for you would be like, what would your like lasting, like, we dropped a lot of wisdom and knowledge within this, and I want to plug CHJS as well, for those that are listening. But what would be the first step that you would give to the coaches that are listening to this podcast to implement some of the things that we're talking?
The first step, I mean, the first off top, I'm always thinking like it'd be awesome if folks come to a CHJS training, because I feel like it's once you learn a little more about the brain and how it's impacted or its impact within a sports space, it'll change your life, right? Because you'll start thinking about you as an athlete and what you were going through. And once you're able to reflect on like you as an athlete, you'll start realizing like, yo, am I doing that to my kids right now? Right. So from like it's not a plug. It's almost like a plug, but I'm saying like if you can come to a CHS training, we do trainings with no matter what sport it is. I know we're talking basketball. We have trainings that we've kind of locked in with the Clippers, so junior Clippers. For this year, next year, we do trainings with LA Rec and Parks with their basketball. If you're into baseball, we have partnership with the Dodgers, right? So like we're kind of everywhere, especially if you're near Los Angeles. But I can send more resources on like where coaches can come to get some more of that knowledge. We also have resources online that they can check out. But if they're not going to do that, I would say just start being a little more mindful of like how can I create more safety for my kids, right? How can I design my space and my communication to where like my kids feel safe and they feel like their brains can be regulated, right? If you can prioritize safety, you can prioritize connection and relationships first, right? Kind of Ted Lasso type, right? The skills and the X's and O's are going to hit even better, right? So really just lead with love, I feel like. And then you can build trust and the strategies and the X's and O's in the skill development type information can come after.
It's a perfect way to end our podcast. I think that's a great way to end it. And then obviously we still have some more stuff to talk about, so we'll have to invite you back because we didn't even talk about the global game. We didn't talk about the skill development piece, but I really appreciate you dropping all the wisdom. What's the best, website and place where they can connect with CHJS and
Yeah.
even yourself?
Oh yeah, for sure. So on our Instagram, we have a link on there at CHJS.org. So CHJS.org is our Instagram tag. We have a link tree on there that like has access to our playbook, Nothing Heals Like Sport playbook. We have a podcast called Coaching While Black. We have awesome guests on there within the sport-based youth development and just like pro sports kind of ecosystem in Los Angeles. Just a different like one pagers around just like thinking about trauma, adversity, and stress on the brain. Just so many resources there. So I would check that out. And if you just want to kind of follow my journey, have any questions for me, my Instagram is Vic. It's kind of complicated. _Johnson. I'm sure we'll be able to share that on your page somewhere so somebody could just click on it. But I'm here as well. I'm LA City manager again with CHJS. Anything basketball related. I operate under Phoenix Basketball in Los Angeles and Tokyo. So I'm here for anybody that has any questions and just would love to just keep connecting with folks throughout the basketball space, but just also just within the coaching ecosystem. 'Cause I love sport, man. I just want everybody to be thriving. And I'm not perfect. I'm not saying I'm perfect at all, but just understand that we all have a little more work to do so that we can create this awesome community that we always envision as creating.
100%. No, I appreciate you, and I can definitely testify. I've been to a CHJS training. I feel like that's what really kind of started opening my eyes to BTG philosophy, and I had a Boys and Girls Club background, so a lot of it kind of fit in with what I was, layering on top. So it's really helped me as a coach. So for the coaches that are listening, go listen, and I really appreciate your time today, Vic.
I appreciate you, yo. Just this platform. This platform is awesome. To meet like-minded folks like yourself, and there's more out there. We're just gonna keep building that community, man. Appreciate you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Beyond the Scoreboard podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure that you subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts and share it with a friend, coach, or parent you feel like would get value from this episode. It's our responsibility to impact as many parents and coaches who are the ones that are impacting our athletes. That's how we create a ripple effect. So thank you for being a part of our community, and we look forward to serving you all next week.